So, welcome again to our lesson on Paul's two letters to the church at Corinth. I should turn off my phone so that I'm not being distracted and make sure. All right, make sure that things are going good. We are looking at two of the most significant letters in the New Testament, and Paul's two letters to the people of the Corinthian church. And if you weren't here last week or didn't catch it online, just to recap in about 2 minutes, Paul, we know, planted the church in Corinth. We talked about last week the place in the book of Acts that details Paul's visit to Corinth, his planting of the church at Corinth. We know that Corinth as a city was a major trade route, a major wealthy city on an isthmus. One of those words that's kind of hard to say. An isthmus is a little tiny strip of land. It was about 4 miles wide that connected two larger sections of Greece with Mediterranean on either side, which meant that trade routes went from north to south and even east to west, as ships would either dock on one side of the isthmus, unload their cargo, haul it 4 miles across, load it onto another ship, which saved them 200 miles of travel around the south end of Greece. Or literally, sometimes the ships would be put on rollers and travel 4 miles across the isthmus and then go back in the water. But whether it was east to west or north to south, the trade routes made it a wealthy place, a trade center, and the fact that there was a amazing, huge temple there, the temple of Aphrodite. Her Greek name, Venus would be her Roman name. Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The temple was a temple that employed 1,000 sacred prostitutes. So Corinth was, not original to me, Corinth was the Las Vegas of the ancient world, the Sin City of the ancient world, a place where you could buy just about anything or anyone. You could find anything that was for sale, a mix of people of all different backgrounds and races and nationalities and income levels, including a fairly large Jewish population. And so as we covered last week, Paul, that's where he planted this church, in a maybe not the kind of ground or soil that would be ideal for planting a church in a, quote, sin city. But that's where we now have to challenges and problems and some of the things that were going on in the Corinthian church. And so last week we covered just the first chapter, where Paul, after his initial greeting and thanking God for them, said he was dismayed at the divisions in the church, that there were, we might call them cliques, we might call them subgroups, we might call them something else. But inside the Corinthian church, there was a division among who they thought was the true spiritual leader of that they looked to. Was it Paul, who had founded the church? Was it Apollos, who was another preacher who was very skilled orator? Was it Peter, who, of course, the rock, the one who what Jesus really gave a special position in the church too? Or was it, as some in the church said, we don't follow anyone, we're just the true Christians? And Paul is dismayed at this divisiveness, this cliquiness in this church. And he says, why would you say you follow me? I'm just a messenger. Why would you say you follow Peter or Apollos? We're just messengers. The church is built not on any of us. The church is built on Christ. And then he starts a discussion in the second half of that first chapter that he's going to follow up in the next couple of chapters about wisdom. And he makes the statement that God's wisdom is greater than the wisdom that the Greeks look to for wisdom. And we'll talk more about that in the second chapter. But the discussion of what is true wisdom, what does it mean to say someone has wisdom, and who could be called foolish or a fool? So having said that, let me say something that I was going to mention last time, and that's I mentioned before, when you think about Paul's letters, I mentioned before, we don't have any of his original manuscripts. We don't have the original handwritten copies that Paul wrote. What we have are copies of copies of copies. That as Paul wrote to these churches made copies to pass on to fellow churches because they thought his advice was so helpful that they made copies, and those churches would make more copies, and more copies were made until there were lots of copies of Paul's letters out there. But given the culture and given the limitations of writing paper, papyrus, and things like that, often these are fragile pieces of letters. What we have actually found, what you would go to a museum and find, would be hundreds and hundreds of years old, and very few of them would be a complete letter of 1 Corinthians or a complete letter of 2 Corinthians. They would be a broken off piece of a scroll, a broken off piece of a letter. And there's a whole school of scholarship that studies these pieces and puts them together and makes sure that we have accurate representation. There's one thing that scholars kind of believe about these two letters. We know that Paul's letter is a response to a letter he received from the Corinthians detailing their problems. He mentions Chloe as somebody that he's gotten this information from. So Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians, is response to a letter he's received. And we don't have that letter. We don't have the letter he's responding to. So we're listening to his response to something, and we don't have the letter he's responding to. We believe that after he wrote this letter, 1 Corinthians, he actually went back to Corinth and paid them a visit. And some of the challenges and difficulties got resolved. Because you go to 2 Corinthians, and it seems like a much happier letter. Until you get to 2 Corinthians 10 to 13. Then it changes tone. And the first 9 chapters seem happy, and then the last 4 chapters seem, once again, he's upset. And so some scholars, and we'll talk more about this when we get to 2 Corinthians, some scholars think that 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 is actually a different letter. And that 2 Corinthians 1 through 9 and 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 are 2 different letters that, as they were copied and recopied and recopied, just got put on the same scroll, but actually they're out of order. And that 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 actually is a separate letter that fell in between the 2 letters. And I'll talk more about that later. But when we see that shift in tone and shift in focus, there's something going on there. And so some people think that there's actually 3 letters that Paul wrote. The first one, the second one being 2 Corinthians 10 to 13, called the severe letter, and then the third letter being 2 Corinthians 1 through 9. And if that's confusing, I'll talk about that more. But all of that to say, scholarship of taking pieces of scrolls and trying to make sure we have them chronologically in the right order, because these scrolls are very fragile, and there's no chapter headings, there's no verses, there's no... they use the paper right up to the edge. There's no margins. So sometimes biblical scholarship, trying to make sure we have the most accurate texts and the most accurate copies, is a science in and of itself. Modern scholarship sometimes has tools that they didn't have when they published the King James Bible in 1609, 400 plus years ago. We've made improvements in scholarship and in being able to date documents and all kinds of things. So we don't have to worry about that right now. Right now we just have to worry about the fact Paul is responding to problems. We know one of the problems is divisiveness and factionalism and cliques in the church. So having said that, let's look at the 2nd chapter, where Paul says, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 2, "When I came to you, brothers, I didn't come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. That Paul here says, in fear with trembling. You say, well, why? Well, again, we are fortunate when it comes to the 2 letters to Corinth that we know about Paul's experiences in Corinth. So just like we did last week, let's go back to the book of Acts and hear a little bit about Corinth. But specifically, we read about Paul's time in Corinth in Acts 18. But let's see what leads up to that. What was Paul doing before he got to Corinth? He says, when I arrived with fear and trembling. So why does he arrive with fear and trembling? Well, if we go back to, say, chapter 16, we know that Paul heads to Philippi. And his time in Philippi, if you remember, he aids this poor slave girl who had a demonic possession or a mental illness, and he gets in trouble for helping her because her owners, she's a slave, her owners were using her either demonic possession or mental illness to use her as a fortune teller and use her to get other people to pay for her to say sort of wild and crazy things. When Paul frees her from this addiction, this problem, this possession, her owners take Paul and his companion Silas to court, accuse them of being, anti-Roman and preaching strange things and advocating practices that are not fit for Romans. And they're put into a jail, they're whipped, they're put in the stocks, they're beaten. They have the experience with the earthquake. The Philippian jailer almost kills himself. Paul shows compassion to him. He becomes a Christian. And so you have their whole experience in Philippi. They leave Philippi having planted a church there. Then the next few stops are Thessalonica and Berea. Those are in chapter 17. In both of those places, Paul has initial success, and then a Jewish faction who is jealous of his success raises mobs, and he's driven out of town by mobs under threat of death. Let me grab my water here real quick. In Thessalonica, after his initial success, he has a large number of converts, but it says 17:5. Jews were jealous. They rounded up some bad characters in the marketplace. They formed a mob. They started a riot. And we go through and find out that he has to leave town to save his skin. He goes to a place called Berea. He has success there as well. But some of those same Jews from Thessalonica follow him to Berea, get everybody all riled up there too, and Paul has to flee there as well. That's when he goes to Athens. And we talked a little bit about that last week. Athens is, if Corinth is the Sin City, the Las Vegas of the ancient world, Athens is the Harvard, the Boston, the Yale, the Ivy League, whatever you think of as the most highly educated place in America. That's the analogy for Athens. And it's the home of Greek philosophy, which, as I mentioned last week, I know something about from my degree in philosophy from OU. And that's where Paul tries a different tack, because there is almost no Jewish community. So he goes straight to the Gentiles. And again, this is a whole nother lesson that I've talked about in other times. But when he goes to Athens, his approach is not to start in the synagogue. His approach is to start a conversation about the monuments and the temples and the things that he sees in Athens. He notices, I've seen monuments all over Athens that say, to the unknown God. Which goes back in Athens history to a time a plague struck the city. They didn't know which god was mad at them, so they just sacrificed animals all over town and put up monuments to the unknown God, hoping that somehow one of the gods up there in the pantheon of Greek mythology would be pleased by the sacrifice. So all over Athens there were monuments to the unknown God. Paul uses that to say, I've seen your monuments to the unknown God. Let me tell you about the God that you don't know. And he uses that as a starting place to tell them about the God of Judaism, the God of creation, then to tell them about Jesus. He quotes Greek poets, not Old Testament, because for the Greek philosophers, the Old Testament would be totally irrelevant. It would carry no authority or weight to a Greek audience. So he doesn't even quote the Old Testament. He quotes Greek poetry to try to make an impression. And he ends up getting an invitation to come and debate with the philosophers on Mars Hill at the Areopagus. And when he gets to the part about the resurrection, they laugh at him. And the summation of his time in Athens, which is 1732, when they being the philosophers, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Others said, we'll hear you again on this subject. And Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. But compared to his other places, Athens was not a very successful trip. It doesn't say he planted a church. It says there was a few people who believed in his preaching, but there's no church planted in Athens. He leaves. He kind of can't wait to get out of there, and that's when he gets to Corinth. I say all that because here in 1 Corinthians 2, he says, when I got to Corinth, he's talking about when he arrived, he was debating with the philosophers, quoting Greek poetry, and it didn't work. So he says, when I came here, I was resolved to not try to win anyone with eloquence, not to try to win anyone with oratory skill. I was convinced I was only going to win people with the basic facts. He says, demonstration of the Spirit's power. So his preaching is, meat and potatoes preaching. It's not fancy words. Now here is also a little bit of he's differentiating himself from Apollos, this fellow that he mentioned at the beginning. Apollos was a trained orator, a trained speaker. And many people were captivated by that. And Paul is just saying, that's not me. I'm not a trained orator. I'm not a fancy, eloquent speaker. I just told you the basic facts about Jesus, about his life, about his teachings, about his death, about his resurrection. I stuck with that. And he said, a demonstration of the Spirit's power. Now, you say, what does that mean? It's not necessarily miracles, although in the book of Acts we do read of some miraculous things happening in Paul's ministry. What is a demonstration of the Spirit's power? Well, often the biggest demonstration of the Spirit's power is lives that are converted, people that are changed, people that go from one kind of life to a new kind of life, people who do a 180-degree turnaround. An old story about over in England, a fellow had become a Christian, and he went to work, and his fellow workers, who were kind of rough men, were making fun of him for his newfound faith. And they said, you don't really believe all that stuff about turning water into wine, do you? He said, I don't know about that, but in my house, he says, Jesus has turned beer into furniture and groceries, because his life had changed, and he had left behind a life of alcoholism and family neglect, and had become a different person. The evidence was a changed life. That was the power of the Spirit. Not so much changing water into wine as it was changing a man who was a poor husband and a poor father and not a good fellow into somebody who now was a better husband and a better father and a better worker and a better man. It was the change of life that was the sign of the Spirit's power. And so Paul is saying, I came just to tell the basic gospel truth, and that was the evidence of power. Now he gets now into a discussion of this whole idea of wisdom again in chapter 2, verse 6. He says, we do, however, after he said, I'm just telling you the basic facts, just the basic gospel. We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age, who are coming to nothing. No, we speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that's been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, as it is written, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. The ancient church, the early church, the first century church had a couple of words in Greek that I learned long ago that kind of, I think, are important. One is kerygma. Those online, I'm not sure if you can see this. K-E-R, I'm not sure I spell it right. K-E-R-Y-G-M-A. Kerygma. K-E-R-Y-G-M-A. Kerygma is the Greek word that basically means proclamation. It is, in the early church, it is Jesus was born of a virgin. He taught. He was turned over to the Romans. He was crucified. He was buried. The third day he rose from the dead and he ascended into heaven. It is the events of the life of Christ. That is the kerygma. That is the proclamation. But after the kerygma comes the didache. And that means the teaching. There's the proclamation of this is who Jesus was and this is his life. But then somebody has to say, well, what does that mean? I mean, if you went to someone who had never heard anything about Christianity before, had no context, and just said, God sent his son and he taught and he did miracles and he was unfairly accused of things and he was executed, but even though he was killed, on the third day he came back to life and then he returned to God the Creator. People would say, wow, that's a cool story. What does it have to do with me? How does that have any impact on my life? What does that have to do with anything about me? The didache, the teaching, is saying, what is the significance of Jesus' life and death and resurrection? To simply tell the story of his life, death, and resurrection doesn't tell us how does that change me. What does that say about my death? What does that say about my life? What does that say about my hope for something beyond this life? What is that, the significance of Jesus? What is the death of the Son of God? What does that do? What did that mean? The teaching is explaining not just what Jesus did, but how does it impact us? How does it save us? What difference does it make for us? And so the early church had the proclamation of this is who Jesus was, but then they had the teaching about and how does that change my life? And Paul would say both are a part passed on to you there in Corinth. By his Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. Who among men knows the thoughts of a man except a man's spirit within him? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. We haven't received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who's from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught to us by human wisdom, or words taught by the Spirit, but words taught by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths in spiritual words. The man without spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God. They are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them, because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual man makes judgments about all things, but he himself is not subject to any man's judgment. Who has known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him? And by the way, that's from Isaiah 40. The earlier quote, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, that's also from Isaiah. That's from Isaiah 64. But we have the mind of Christ. Now I have to say this passage is a little more challenging than some of what comes before it. It's a little talking about the deep things and all that. Let's think about some of what it means. One, he's talking about people who have a mature faith. And he talks about only those who have secret wisdom that no one else understands. There's some things that only once we have been exposed to the teachings of Christ, only once we have heard the gospel, and not just the bare bones, maybe Apostles' Creed, but what the meaning behind those. Why did Jesus have to go to the cross? What does his death mean for us? What does his resurrection mean for us? There's some things that only once we are introduced to all that, then some things make sense to us. Like, for example, baptism. Again, think about somebody who's totally outside the church. They walk in and they see a man up front either pouring water on somebody's head or pushing somebody underwater in a big tub. And then everybody kind of applauds and cheers and smiles, and they go, they're giving the guy a bath? I mean, why are they doing that? And the guy's not even naked. Is he taking a bath, but he's got his clothes on? And without any context, it doesn't make any sense. Without some knowledge of the Christian story. Communion. We're going to have, not this Sunday, but the following Sunday, the first Sunday of October, is what's called World Communion Sunday. And churches all over Christianity of different types. Everybody is asked to celebrate communion on the same Sunday. Who accused Christians of being cannibals. They said, we hear they gather together and they eat flesh and they drink blood. They gather together and they talk about eating flesh and drinking blood. And to the outsider, that sounds terrible. But when we understand the context of Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper, we understand what it means. We understand the meaning underneath the bread or the cup or the water of baptism. So when he says some of this is foolishness to those who don't understand, who are outside, to them it seems like, well, that's meaningless. It doesn't have any purpose. He says there, only the Holy Spirit can speak to us of the inner heart of God. And again, not to get too much just into Greek, but in Greek, there are two words that we often, in our English, we often use them interchangeably, soul and spirit. In Greek, there are two different things, soul and spirit. The Greek word that's usually translated soul is the Greek word suke, okay? P-S-U-C-H-E, suke. And we translate that word in Greek, suke, we usually translate it as the word soul. It probably, if you wanted to have a word that really captures the Greek, maybe the word, like a word like life force. Everything in Greek, in the Greek understanding of the world, every living thing has soul. Soul is basically the spark of life. We're alive. We have soul. The dogs and cats have soul. The animals have soul. It's this life force, as opposed to a rock or a table or something else. Anything that's alive has soul, has this life force. Any living creature. Spirit, the Greek word there is pneuma. P-N-E-U-M-A. Pneuma. Like the word pneumatic or pneumonia. And that is the word that means spirit. And that's something that's not just something that's alive. It is something that is from God. It is something that is related to our relationship to God. It is not tangible. It is something that's spiritual. So when he talks about people who, for them, spiritual things don't make any sense, he said they have a life force. They understand, quote, soul, but they don't understand spirit. And I was reading somebody writing about this, and think about it this way. People for whom things seem foolish. Let's say there's a person, and unfortunately there's a lot of folks in culture now who would fit this. There are people who would say, when it comes to sex, well, it's recreation, it's pleasure. That's what it is. It's recreation and pleasure. And when you start to talk to them about things like intimacy or chastity, they go, that's just foolishness. You're assigning it something that I don't see at all. They say it's just something you do to procreate the race and receive pleasure. And you say, well, no, it's more than that. It's about intimacy. It's about connection. It's about devotion. It's about intimacy between a man and a woman. It's about a spiritual connection between people. And they go, well, that's just a bunch of baloney. That's foolishness. It's just two people just enjoying, sensations and maybe making a new child, but that's all there is to it. And when you try to talk to them about concepts like chastity or fidelity or intimacy, they go, well, you're just talking foolishness. Or think about somebody who says, well, money and things, purpose is to get as much of that as you can. Get as much as you can to meet your immediate needs, and then get as much more as you possibly can, and to gather and get as much material things, as much money, as much pleasure, as much stuff as you can. And you say to them, well, what about charity? What about generosity? And they'd say, well, you're just talking foolishness. There's no such thing. That's the difference between the material person and the spiritual person. The material person looks at certain things as just foolishness. I mean, there are some people who would think helping a stranger, why would you do that? That's just foolishness. Giving money to somebody you don't know who's hungry, why? They're not your family. Why would you do that? That's just foolishness. Paul says there are many things about a spiritual life or about a Christian life that to someone on the outside just look like foolishness. Why would you do that? And sadly, if that was true 2,000 years ago, it's still true today. Have you ever looked at a survey of how many Americans give anything to any charity ever? It's far below 50%.
Far below what percent?
Far below 50%. the majority of Americans never give anything to any charity of any kind. Because why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just keep it for yourself? There are things that we, because we are people of faith, and we would say we are spiritual people, and not to put us above other people. I'm just saying, when he talks about foolish, the world looks at some of Christianity as, quote, foolishness. He's not talking about ignorance. Okay, there's a difference there. I mean, there is a kind of Christian ignorance that I think is not seemly for a Christian. It is not seemly for a Christian to be anti-education, anti-science, anti-learning. I mean, there is a certain brand of maybe fundamentalism that looks at education as dangerous, lest it challenge their own preconceived ideas. So when Paul is saying the world looks at Christianity and sees it as foolish, he's not talking about an anti-intellectual strain of Christianity and an anti-learning strain. He's talking about that as in the Roman world, which is what he's writing to. He's writing to a world in the Roman Empire. There was an incredible level of cruelty that is shocking to us. See, well, there was slavery, which to us now seems abhorrent that slavery could exist. Well, but the law in Rome was a slave was not a person. They were Roman law defined a slave as a living tool. And when your tool got too sick or old to work anymore, you threw it out to the streets, into the garbage. Because a slave was a living tool. And that was not people, that was just normal life. If a child was born with a handicap, missing a limb or blind or something else, you threw it in the trash. That was normal Roman practice. The Christians started doing things that to the average Roman seemed foolish. They would go to where they dumped the babies that were not perfect and they would adopt them. To the Roman mind, that was foolishness. Foolishness to show care or compassion for a damaged goods person that was not part of your family, or even it was part of your family. To the average Roman, that was foolishness. And we live now 2,000 years of the influence of Christianity that has, that people who are atheists, people who are agnostic, people who even dislike Christianity don't know history and don't realize that so much of what we now take for granted about the care of the less fortunate, things like public education and public hospitals and charity and care for folks who are handicapped, that all came out of Christianity. The Roman world that Paul is writing to is dog eat dog. It is survival of the fittest. It is, now, people could show love and compassion for the people that they loved. But Jesus' teachings were about loving the stranger, even the enemy. And as the church began to take up that teaching of caring for those that were not, that you didn't love, but were simply, when Jesus tells the story in Matthew 25, I was hungry and you fed me, I was thirsty and you gave me a drink, I was in prison and you visited me, I was a stranger and you welcomed me, etc. And they say, when, Lord? When you did it for the least of these, my sisters and brothers, you did it for me. That is a radical teaching of Jesus. That is not the way the Roman mind thought. And people who resisted Christianity, as Christianity began to take hold in the Roman Empire, why did they throw Christians to the wild animals? Why did they torture Christians? Why did they throw them to the lions? Because they were unloyal to Rome. Disloyal to Rome. And the argument against Christianity was Christianity weakens the empire. It makes the empire soft. It weakens the empire by making people, rescue these deformed babies and actually care about these slaves and things like that. Christianity changes culture. Now, are there dark spots in the history of Christianity? Yes, there's dark spots in the history of Christianity. We can talk about the Crusades and all those things. But in general, so many of the things we take for granted, say like public education, public hospitals, opposition to slavery, those all are born out of Christianity, which the people at the time saw as foolishness, as weakness. So when you hear him talking about these things that are the world sees as weak, as foolishness, it's not stupidity, okay? It's not ignorance of opposition to learning. So anyway, enough about that. Chapter 3. Okay. Brothers, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you are not yet ready for it. Indeed, you're still not ready. You're still worldly. For since there's jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere men? For when one of you says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere men? What after all is Apollos? What is Paul? Only servants, through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants or he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor. We're God's fellow workers. You're God's field. You're God's building. So he's going back to his initial problem with what's happening in Corinth. And he says, basically, you are babes in Christ. You're not mature Christians. And he says, how do I know you're not mature Christians? Because you're quarreling with each other. Because you're jealous of each other. And he says, the fact that you're jealous of each other and quarreling with each other shows to me that you are immature Christians, that you are baby Christians. And as baby Christians, you can't handle solid food. You can only handle milk. Milk meaning the most elemental Christian teachings, but you're not ready for a mature faith. And that's a pretty hard thing to say. A couple of the words there he uses when he says you're worldly, at least since you are, or you're mere men. You're worldly, you're mere men. The word, let me give you another Greek word. And again, I know Greek words doesn't always necessarily mean much to you, but sometimes the Greek word has a flavor to it that the English translation just can't quite convey, which is the value, one, of course, knowing other languages. And believe me, studying Greek and Hebrew is not a picnic, but it is helpful and useful to kind of open your brain to the fact that every time we read the Bible, unless you're a Greek and Hebrew scholar, which I'm not, the classes I took in seminary a long time ago allowed me to be able to understand the language, but sure, if I open up the Greek New Testament, I can't just read it, or the Hebrew Bible, I can't just read it. But the word that he says there for worldly, sarkanoi. Okay, it means basically fleshly. Or we might say carnal. You're dominated by your flesh. Now, we're all made of flesh. I mean, that's what it means to be a human being. We all are made of flesh. As a matter of fact, this word carnal. If I point out, we use it in a lot of our English words. When the eternal Son of God took on the form of a human baby, that miracle we call what? Incarnation. The incarnation. The incarnation. Carnal. Carnal means in the flesh. So when we say incarnation, the incarnation is the miracle of Jesus taking on what is the Spanish word for meat? Carne. Right. So carne means flesh. And he's saying you Corinthians, you're being sarkanoi. You're being of the flesh. You're being carnal. Now sometimes we hear the word carnal in English and we think it means sexual. It doesn't mean that here. It just means you're thinking about it purely from you're an animal. You're an intelligent animal, but you're just flesh and blood, as opposed to being spiritual, being more than just a body of flesh. To be spiritual is to be this mature believer, and that's what he says. You're still too carnal. You're still too sarkanoi. That's why I can only give you milk. You're not ready for the deeper things of Christ. And the deeper things is not like secret knowledge or something like that. It's just that there is indeed such a thing as Christian maturity. And, there's something, if you've ever seen somebody who is a brand new Christian, especially an adult who has that 180-degree turnaround and becomes a new believer, it's a marvelous and wonderful thing, but sometimes they kind of go off the deep end in terms of thinking they're ready to preach or teach when they still only have milk. They haven't really just had enough experience as a follower of Jesus yet to lead or to share. They're just a little too green to be able to have that. And there is something to Christian maturity. That often, you can't take in the whole Bible in a few days. You have to be able to let it seep into you, and you have to really understand a lot of what it means to follow Christ. And you have to, especially the harder parts. I mean, people who go to Billy Graham Crusade, of course, he's dead now, but I mean, people who go to a revival, an event where there's people coming forward, giving their lives to Christ, which is a great thing. Because they hear Jesus can wash your sins away, come and be saved, which is the gospel message. But then if you go home from that experience and you read the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus talking about love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. It's written, don't commit adultery. I say, don't look on a woman with lust. It says, don't murder. I say to you, don't even call your brother a fool. I mean, and you start reading some of these harder teachings of Jesus, and you go, man, what have I gotten myself in for here? This is hard stuff. This is not an easy path here. And that's a part of this Christian maturity. And so Paul says, how do I know you're babies in Christ? Because you're quarreling and because you're jealous. And he says, that's just the proof in the pudding. The fact that you're quarreling and jealous tells me you are not mature Christians. Then he says, the fact that you're saying, well, we're part of the Paul party and we're part of the Apollos party. He again says, I planted the church, I planted the seed, and Apollos came after me and he watered it, but neither one of us has the power to make a plant grow. That's only God. And then he switches analogies. He switches analogies from a plant to a building in verse 10. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should be careful how he builds. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day, capital D, will bring it to light. It'll be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he's built survives, he'll receive his reward. If it's burned up, he'll suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames. Okay, now, that's, again, okay, what are we talking about here? Well, I say he switches analogies. He starts by saying, your faith, your church, I planted the seed. I'm the one who first preached the gospel to you. Then Apollos came and he watered it, and that helped it to grow even more. But it's not the church of Paul or the church of Apollos. It's the church of Jesus. And we're just workers in the field. Only God can make it grow. Then he switches analogies now to say, I laid the foundation. In other words, I planted the church. I'm the one who gave you the gospel. And others have come along since I was there in Corinth with you. Others have come along and built on to the foundation that I laid. Some of that building is good. Some of that's gold. Some of it's straw. And he talks about basically, when fire comes, the gold will last and the straw won't. And he talks about the day. In my Bible, it's capitalized. He's talking about the day of the Lord. He's talking about Judgment Day, when Christ returns. But that's true of any church. I mean, any church is started by, somebody. I mean, this church was started in 1903. The Methodist Church sent a preacher here to try to start a Methodist church here. And, they got a handful of people here in Broken Arrow in this new township that was not, before Oklahoma was a state. And they started a little Bible study. They started a little church here. And that, somebody laid the foundation. Then, the new town of Broken Arrow said, well, we've set aside one piece of town for a church. And whichever church has the most folks show up, we'll give them the land. And the Methodists had the most folks show up, so we got the land here at the corner of College and Main. From 1903 until today, there's been lots of layers built on to that foundation. I'm not talking about the physical building. I'm talking about, the people, the church. Some of those layers have been really good, and a few of them probably haven't been so good. But it's a matter of building it up. But the point being, nothing works on a faulty foundation. If the foundation isn't solid, doesn't matter how good the building is afterwards. If the foundation is faulty, no matter how good the succeeding stories are, the building's going to fall over. And he basically says the foundation has to be Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the only foundation. Again, if a church is founded on, it's going to be founded on, this political idea plus Jesus, or this cause plus Jesus. It's not going to work. The foundation has to be Jesus, or it's not a true church if it's not founded on the rock. And again, Jesus himself says, two people built houses. One built it on sand, and one built it on rock. And the one that was built on sand, when the storms came and the floods came and the storms came, the whole thing was washed away. A church that is built on a foundation other than Christ will not survive the storms. So then he goes on, verse 16. Don't you know that you yourselves, and here he's talking about both them individually and as a church, you yourselves are God's temple and God's Spirit lives in you. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For sanctuaries where the Spirit of God dwells. And Paul often says, if we're sanctuaries where God dwells, what are you doing with your sanctuary? What are you doing with your temple? Are you putting it in places that are unfit and unwise and unworthy of being the temple of God? Don't deceive yourself. Verse 18. If any one of you thinks he's wise by the standards of this age, he should become a fool, in quotes, so that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it's written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile. So then, no more boasting about men. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Peter or the world or life or death or the present or the future. All are yours. And you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. So this is kind of his finishing about the whole wise and foolishness part. I had a fellow that I used to go to when we'd go to youth camps as one of the leaders. There was a guy from another church, and he must have had 10 shirts of all different colors that all had said the same thing. Because every day he wore the same shirt, except one day it was blue, one day it was red, one day it was green. And the front always had the same thing. On the front it said, "Fool for Christ." Fool for Christ. And on the back it said, "Whose fool are you?" And again, got to be careful with that word, that we understand what he's saying when he says fool. He's not saying be ignorant. He's not saying be stupid. He's not saying be frivolous. He's not saying be goofy. When we hear the word fool, I don't know, we may think of a lot of things. But he's trying to say, the things that when the world, and remember, we're talking about a Roman Empire, and Christianity is a tiny minority, a tiny fledgling little new thing. And the Roman Empire is a giant behemoth, and the city of Corinth especially is a town it's all built on wealth and trade and commerce and sex. And he's saying, people are going to look at what you are doing as this new community of followers of Jesus, and they're going to say, look at those fools. And he says, they think of themselves as wise, and they think of you as fools. But he's saying, the reality is, who's really the fool? He's saying, they are the true fools because they're blind to the true Creator, to the true God, and to true life, with their assumptions about what matters and what is appropriate. And you, even though they call you fools, it's your wisdom, your godly wisdom, is different from their so-called wisdom. And as I said before, when I was talking about last week about when the years that I spent as a grad student in the philosophy department, as a teaching assistant, if anybody And I can say this because I was one, because I have all these colleagues who are grad students and PhD students in philosophy. If anybody in the academic world is pretentious, it's philosophy people. People in the philosophy department truly think they are the smartest people in the whole school and maybe in the whole world. People who have degrees in philosophy really think they are truly the smartest people in the world. Hopefully I did not ever have that quite attitude, because I said I was the only Christian in the department. But I have a shirt that I have that I wear sometimes on the weekends as a joke, and and the shirt says, "Don't worry, I have a philosophy degree." Because when you have a philosophy degree, you can solve any problem. Except that didn't work at our house when the toilet's not working. Somehow my philosophy degree doesn't seem to be able to solve that problem. But that's the atmosphere. And remember, that's Corinth. One more chapter. I only did one last week because of so much introductory, so we're going to zip through 3 chapters tonight, just so we can stay on track. Chapter 4. So then, men ought to regard us as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the secret things of God. Now, it's required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I care very little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I don't even judge myself. My conscience is clear. That does not make me innocent. It's the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He'll bring to light what is hidden in darkness, and he'll expose the motives of men's hearts. That time, each will receive his praise from God. Entrusted with secrets. And again, not that Christianity has anything that we're unwilling to share with everybody. Matter of fact, our whole thing is we want everybody to know what we know. We want everybody to hear the truth of the gospel. We want everybody to hear about Jesus. But this little group in Corinth, this little small new growing thing, they know something that no one else in town knows, and they may think of themselves as small or insignificant, persecuted, dismissed, treated as if they're foolish. You know something they don't. Now, brothers, verse 6, I have applied these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, so that you may learn from us the meaning of the saying, don't go beyond what's written. Then you will not take pride in one man over another man. Who makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you didn't receive? There's a verse just to pull out of this letter. What do you have that you didn't receive? What do you have that did not come from God? The only true answer is nothing. We can't say that anything we have that we made or built ourselves. It all ultimately came from God's creation. Everything we have came from God. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the land we walk on, the people we love. There's nothing we have that we didn't receive. It's all from God. And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? Then this last part of this chapter, Paul gets kind of nasty, to be honest. And I say nasty, he is irritated. He is irritated at the swelled heads of many of the people in this Corinthian church. Not only do they have a problem with jealousy and division, they have a problem with thinking that they are all that in a bag of chips, that they have really arrived, that they are spiritually mature. Even though he says you're still babies in Christ, that's not what they think. They think they have got it all figured out. And here's where you have to understand, because this can be a confusing passage if you cannot read Paul's heavy sarcasm.